Okay, um, I love this book, First Kings, and it's got so much history in it. Old Testament's full of history. It gives us so much background into why the New Testament exists. And so I've been looking forward to this study for a couple months while we're going through Thessalonians. I knew it was coming in First Kings, and so glad we're able to go through it. And it's just a great book to find so much history and so much evidence of God, even though it was a bad time in Israel's history. So good to start out here in 1 Kings again. We'll be in chapter 17. We're going to work in 18 as well. And welcome to everybody that's watching us on the Facebook. Glad you're able to join us. And this week's lesson is called Proven in our book. But we're going to get some background as we head into this section, because we're going to get into the life of a man named Elijah. Now, easily mixed up between Elijah and Elisha, he's the guy who would follow Elijah, and we'll get into him in the coming weeks. But Elijah was one man born in a terrible time in Israel's history. But we're going to learn through today's lesson, hopefully, that one person can make a huge difference if they're willing to follow God. The whole time I was studying this week, I was looking at this one person, Elijah, doing the things that he was doing, and people in history before him started to pop in my mind, like David, when he went down to fight against Goliath. No one else was even interested in fighting Goliath, but David was. And different ones who stepped up. Moses, who listened to God and said, "Go to Pharaoh and tell the people, tell him to let our people go." And Moses was willing to step up. So that one person can make a difference. But as we start out, we've been studying through these kings. Remember, we had the division in the nation of Israel. They came here in unity. And after so many years, especially after Solomon's reign, some pagan things started to come into the picture. And after Solomon, the nation split. And we studied that a few weeks ago. And then last week, Ed went through and taught us about a lot of the kings that were in the northern and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom remained called Israel. The southern kingdom was called Judah, because the tribe of Judah was the majority of that people group, and so they called themselves Judah. But the northern kingdom was unique in that none of its kings sought to follow God. None. Not one. In fact, it was a constant assault on whoever was in power by the next person in line who wanted to be in power. Some of them didn't reign more than 7 days. Some of them had 7 years. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom, the kingly reigns lasted longer, 30 and 40 years. A basic life of an adult in that time period, as they would pass off the control to their son or their offspring. And so, but in the northern kingdom, things were going haywire, and that's because there was so much pagan worship. And if you look through those chapters 15 and 16, you see those different names. And the one we're going to hit on first is Omri, King Omri. We're about 5 generations down from Jeroboam, and Omri was the king, and he wasn't king very long, but his son Ahab, remember this name Ahab, he became the king when Omri died. And Ahab was the most wicked king in the northern kingdom of Israel's history, the most wicked king. And there was another reason he was the most wicked, because he married a woman by the name of Jezebel. Everybody knows that name. Because you've heard it before in Bible history and Sunday school and different messages. But Jezebel did something that no one else had done before. You see, when Omri, Ahab's dad, was the king, he started these small alliances with other nations. And they were made because of trade. He wanted to have international trade between these nations. When Ahab came along, he went even farther, and he married Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of Sidon. Sidon was a pagan hotbed, and this is where Baal, we've heard of Baal before, this is where Baal was pronounced as the god, Baal was the god that the people in Sidon worshipped. And Ahab says, why not? I'll marry Jezebel, and then we can have this huge political alliance. We can have an international trade alliance, a commerce, and we can have access to all kinds of things, because I'm going to have a kingship that is greater than any ever in history, and we're just going to be prosperous, and we're going to have all kinds of money and wealth. And by marrying Jezebel, it was another way for him to do this. There was only one problem with that picture, because Ahab didn't care about honoring God anyway. He brought in Jezebel, and he didn't just get goods and goods and foods and commodities. He also got pagan gods and pagan worship, because Jezebel came from this area that worshiped Baal. And so all these Baal worshipers came with her. She brought in Baal worshiping priests. She brought in pagan altars and everything else, and Ahab was just fine with that. He said, that sounds great. Why not? One more God. The one God we've heard of all our lives, he's really not strong enough anyway. Why not have another one? And the minute I read this, I started to think about our world today. That's exactly the way the world has taken the viewpoint about God. It's that, well, this Bible talks about a God, but and that sounds great and everything, but how about this other religion I hear about? That sounds pretty good too. And then how about this other one over here? That sounds pretty good too. And before you know it, we've got this big buffet of religions, and people today, if you ask them, do you believe in God? They'll say, there's a good chance they may give you I believe in that a little bit, but I believe in this too, and I believe in this too. And there's a word for that, it's called syncretism, when we try to take all these other religions, just blend them together and make this big mush and worship that. Does that not sound so much like our world today, as people refuse to pick something? They refuse to choose, I'm going to follow God or I'm going to follow something else. There's a word that we know that's called neutral. And if you look it up, it comes from two small words, and I don't remember what they were, but they mean, in a sense, not either. You remember that for years and years we've heard of Switzerland staying neutral. They won't get involved in anything. And it's because they say, I'm not picking you guys, and I'm not picking you guys. We're gonna just stay here on our own turf. I'm not picking either. And there's a lot of people today that'll say that. If you say, well, do you believe in God? Well, not really. But I don't believe in Satan either. I don't believe in this. I don't believe in any of it. They're essentially standing in midair. And so they're not picking anything. So what's happened here is Ahab has taken that mindset. Not only has Ahab taken that mindset, all the 10 tribes in the northern kingdom of Israel have taken that mindset as well. They've just compromised. Some of them may have not believed in Baal. They may have believed in God, but they were unwilling to stand up to Ahab and say this is wrong, including his own people within his administration. If they did believe in God, we don't have any record of it because they didn't say anything. No one was willing to stand up to Ahab. No one was willing to stand up to Jezebel. They all just went along. We're in danger now of the same thing happening in our world, in our country, in our churches, because there's things being taught, things being said, and policies being put in place that go against God's word, and we as Christians are just as guilty if we sit back and don't speak up and say that's not what God teaches. That's not what the Bible says. Well, there was a man named Elijah, and we just mentioned him. He was a Tishbite, and it says in chapter 17 that he was just a man. It doesn't mention him as being anything special. He was from the Gilead settlers, and he went to Ahab. This is what we don't see much about his background. It's just he comes on the scene as standing in front of Ahab. And he does something. He says, as the Lord God of Israel lives, in whose presence I stand, there will be no dew or rain during these years except by my command. So Elijah here has been told by God, look, you go and tell Ahab, there's a famine coming. There's not going to be any rain until I give you the word. No rain. Now, we can relate to that here lately because we've been through a little dry spell. But it's nothing compared to the dry spell these people would go through, because he goes and tells Ahab this, that there's going to be no rain. And right behind that, he leaves. God tells him to go east and go to the area called the Wadi Cherith, as it's close to the Jordan River, and he says, you're going to stay there, and I will make sure that you're fed. Now this, Elijah's here told, go tell Ahab there's going to be no rain. This didn't affect just Ahab or just Jezebel or just the people. This was going to affect Elijah too. And we read of other famines in the Bible and how that affected people. People starved to death. There was no crops. They couldn't get anything to grow. There's no food for the animals. So this was going to be a terrible time. He doesn't tell him how long this is going to last. He says, it's going to last until I say it's over, which means until God tells me that it's over. And so the minute he's told Ahab this, he leaves and goes to the east toward the Jordan River. And he stays there, and we can do the math on all this, and it's about 3.5 years. So imagine 3.5 years with no rain. We just went 3.5 weeks, seems like, maybe a month, with not any good rain. And we saw just how brown the grass turned and how bad it affected the crops, and everybody was having to water all they could, but no rain means no rain, and there's nothing. And it doesn't take long before the land is parched and everything's hot and dry. And this prosperous place that Ahab and Jezebel had in mind is not going well. And it's not long before Jezebel and Ahab decide, you remember that little guy that came in here and said, no rain? We got to find him. So they start sending out people to find Elijah. Now, in the middle of all this 3.5 years, a few things happen. In verse 17, we're going to highlight them real quick. Elijah is not being fed by his own doing. God tells him, I'm going to make sure you're fed. Go to the Jordan River now to give you something to drink. You got some water there, and I will command the birds to provide food for you. And the birds brought Elijah food and bread all the time, constantly providing nutrition for him. Remember another time when this happened, when the Israelites were out in the wilderness for 40 years and God provided manna. God provides for us when we need something, if we just rely on him. Okay, so not long after this, he goes to Zarephath. He's sent to a widow lady. She's got one son, and they are in this area that is full of Baal worship. We're in an area close to Sidon here. All right, and we're in the Baal territory. And he says, you go there, and there's a lady there, and she's gonna provide a meal for you. You go find her and go tell her to make a meal for you. So he goes to this lady. We're not giving her name. And he says, can you please bring me something to drink and fix me a little cake, a piece of bread? I'm hungry. And she says, I can't, because I only have just enough oil and flour that fits me and my son one more meal, and then we're going to die. And Elijah tells her, says, no, God has said, if you will obey this and you provide for me first, he'll make sure that your food doesn't run out. And this woman, we're not told anything else about her except that she obeyed Elijah. She believed that he was a prophet. She believed what he said when he promised that God would provide for her. And so she takes the little bit of oil and flour that she had, makes him a cake. And then from then on, her and her son had plenty to eat because the oil and the flour never ran out. I'm reminded thereof when Jesus fed the 5,000, how they took the little bit they had. That little boy that had the loaves and the fish, he was willing to give it, and God took it and made more of it. And God here does the same thing with this lady because she was willing to obey and honor God. And she even says, because of you've done this, I believe you. I thank you. Now, right after this, her son gets sick. So on top of what she's done now, she's got to deal with this. And her son gets sick, and he gets so sick until he stops breathing. So we're thinking he's dead here. And he has died. And she says to Elijah, why have you done this? You come to me, and I've fed you, and this is the way you repay me? My son is dead now. So Elijah prays to God and says, oh God, why would you do this? I have been honorable. I've obeyed you. This lady has done for me as you asked, and her son has died. And the Lord tells Elijah to go take the boy and he bring his life back. This is the first resurrection we see in history. In all of history, this is the first one. So it's kind of important to note this. It's not the last one. It'll happen more times, of course, and especially with Jesus. So this is all happening over this 3-year period. Elijah stayed with this lady probably about a year, the best I could research. And so the boy is brought back to life. He gives the boy back to his mom, and she says, "Now I know you are a man of God, and the Lord's word from your mouth is true." This was all she needed to see. She had fed him, and he had provided food. God had made sure that she had plenty. And now her son has died and been resurrected, and the woman thinks. So 3 years have gone by. Okay, so now we're in the chapter 18. And Elijah, after his 3 years, is told by God, go to Ahab. It's time for you to go to him now. The time's up, and we're going to go meet Ahab and tell him what's going on. Because I'm going to try to give the background here at the same time. Remember, these people have been rejecting God this whole time. They have been compromising and worshiping Baal instead. And this hotbed of Baalism had been brought in, and more and more and more the people were leaving God and going to the pagan god instead. Ahab and Jezebel are getting to do whatever they want, except for the problem of there's no rain. And their huge prosperous nation is not getting blessed the way they were wanting. So after this time's over, Jezebel and Ahab have sent people out over and over again, go find that guy. We got to find him. She wouldn't want nothing better than to get her hands around his neck and kill him. And so there comes a point here in chapter 18 where Ahab tells a man named Obadiah. Obadiah was a servant in King Ahab's palace. He was probably like a chief of staff, so to speak. He worked as one of his administration officials. And Ahab and Obadiah go out and they look for grass. He tells them to go look for grass for the animals. And I was listening to one person this week. He says, after 3 years of this, knowing what Elijah had told Ahab, why didn't Ahab by this point think, I don't need to go look for grass, I need to go find God. I don't need to be looking for food for my animals, I need to be looking for forgiveness from God. That's not what he was doing. He's more interested in preserving his reign, preserving his power. Feeding these animals would get things going again. And sends Obadiah out to go find Elijah and to find grass. He's got 2 missions. He had even made deals with other nations and said, if you find Elijah and you don't tell me about it, I'll destroy you. And so he had issued his proclamation, anybody that finds Elijah, bring him to me. Well, God tells Elijah, say, fine, we're not going to wait anymore. You're going to go to Ahab. He runs into Obadiah while he's traveling and tells Obadiah, says, you go tell Ahab, I'm ready. I'm right here. It's time to talk. And Obadiah pleads with him and says, I'm a man of God. Now, if he was a man of God, he sure isn't standing up at Ahab. So he may be a follower of God and not a follower of Baal, but he's not willing to compromise his position. He wants so much to hold his place in the castle that he's willing to forgo a few things, let some things slide. But thank goodness he was tactful, because he could have just gone to Ahab and then he chopped his head off. So he was tactful enough, I guess we'd say, to be a help. So Obadiah goes back to Ahab and says, Elijah said, come here. He's here. So Elijah runs into Ahab and they meet up. And Ahab says, there you are, you troublemaker. Calls him a troublemaker. Now, he was a troublemaker because he's the one that said, there'll be no more rain until I say so. And that's the only way they saw him, was a troublemaker. What's Elijah come back with? You have made trouble for yourselves by disobeying God and his covenant and following a pagan god Baal. Now this was pretty bold. Okay, they want Elijah dead to start with. They've been chasing him for 3 years, couldn't find him. And here Elijah is telling off this king to his face. I'm not the troublemaker, you are. Because if you had kept God's covenant, you wouldn't be in this place to start with. We're not going to look it up, but if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28, read it later, and read what it says, because it talks about the covenant that God made with the people. And he says, if you follow me and keep my commandments, I will bless you. But if you don't, I will parch your land and make it dry. And so this is where Elijah tells Ahab, I'm not the troublemaker. You are. You made this situation for yourself. You chose to dishonor God and follow other gods. You chose to disobey his commandments. And this is what you get for it, a dry, parched land. So it was time for a showdown. He tells Ahab, says, I want you to get everybody together. And when he means everybody, he means everybody. Get everybody in Israel, and we're going to meet on Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel was the place where Baal called home, so to speak. It was the place where the Baal worship was the center. So he was going to give them home field advantage, so to speak. And he says, you get them up there, and then you get all these prophets that you have of Baal, and we're going to meet up there. And so it's funny to me that Ahab obeys this, but he does. So he calls all of Israel together, and he gets all those prophets of Baal together. And then Elijah issues this thing, says, this is what we're going to do. But before he does, I'm going to read what he says in 18. And we're going to look at chapter 18, 20 and 21. Ahab summoned all the Israelites and gathered the prophets at Mount Carmel. Then Elijah approached all the people and said, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is, follow him. And the people didn't answer a word. That sentence hit me, because that's a good sign. Because if they rejected God completely, they just said, forget you, we're with Baal. But the fact that they didn't come back means they were willing to listen. So Elijah says, you're going to have to pick. You cannot flounder around saying this one day and this the next. We're the same way if we're not careful. We'll flounder around. We'll say, well, this week I'm going to be an honest person. I'm going to try to live a pure life of honesty. But on Wednesday, we'll be told a lie. Boom. And we have floundered around. And so Elijah has told his people, you can't keep playing one day with God and one day with Baal. You're going to have to pick. You're going to have to choose. And here's the choice. Who are you going to worship? Are you going to worship God? If so, worship God. And if you're going to worship Baal and kick God to the curb. But make your choice, because he's calling them out. Those 10 tribes had left. You remember when they followed Jeroboam and they went. And Jeroboam didn't have anything to do with God. And they compromised their entire history of being part of the United Nation of Israel so that they could be with the majority. And Elijah says here, today's the day you're going to pick. It's over. You've had 3.5 years of dry land, and you're going to choose. So that's kind of where we start our lesson today in our book, in our study book. But he says, you're going to choose a bull. He gets these bulls together, and he says, and you're going to choose this bull, and you're going to bring down your prophets here, and you guys can go first. So let's start here, and we're going to work in chapter 18 and start in verse 25. And Elijah says to these prophets of Baal, since you're so numerous, now look, there's 850 of these guys standing there. 850. I need to tell you something else before we go further. There was prophets of God too. The problem was Jezebel, every time she found one of them, she killed them. She had them all massacred. And Obadiah has hid 100 of these prophets in a cave. So Obadiah had his sneaky, keep myself in a position of power side, but he was a follower of God, because we see evidence of it. He's protecting God's prophets. He's got 50 in one cave, 50 in another, and he's taking his wealth and he's feeding them and making sure they got something to drink. But here we move forward, and Elijah says to these prophets, since you're so numerous, you choose for yourselves a bull. He pulls out the bulls. He says, pick the one you want. You pick it, whichever one you want. You go first. We're at your Mount Carmel where you worship Baal, and you guys pick the bull and you prepare it. Now, prepare it means to slaughter it, have it cut up in pieces, and they're going to put it on the altar here. Okay, and they're going to have it for sacrifice, but that's not what they were there for. Why did this happen? Because right after this, he says, then call on the name of your God, but don't light the fire. So they were supposed to prepare this bull, get it in pieces like they usually do for a sacrifice, put it down, don't put anything to set it on fire. They were supposed to call on their god Baal, who was so mighty and powerful, to send rain down and burn this bull. Now, Baal was known to these people as being a god of fertility, a god of nature, a god of wind, fire, thunder, and rain. Why did Elijah and why did those people not, instead of doing fire, go with rain? Now, I wanted to talk about this before we go through the lesson because I had not thought about this in this much detail until we were studying this week. But there's a reason that there's fire here. Because every time we see in history, the Israelite history, they would offer sacrifices. What would they use? Fire. What was the sacrifice for? To pay for sin. By this act, this was not going to be a showdown with Elijah's God and Baal. This was going to be more than that, because this was going to be something that would provide a repentance sacrifice on behalf of these people who had left God. They had kicked God to the curb so that they could follow this Baal pagan god, so that they could be part of this popular, prosperous nation that was not so popular and prosperous. And if Baal was so great anyway, why in the world hadn't he sent rain? It's been 3 years. They should have already got the picture by now. But either they were so scared of Ahab and Jezebel that they didn't say anything, or they had just conformed to what the new way was. United States, churches all across America and the world, if not careful, begin to conform to the way the world is. So why not rain and why fire? Because this was going to be more than a showdown between God and Baal. This was going to be a sacrifice. We're going to read on. So he says, call on the name of your God, but don't light the fire. Verse 26. So they took the bull, he gave them, they prepared it, they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Okay? These 850 guys, they got this bull up here. Can't you see it? I want you to picture it in your mind. They got them ready, and they start calling on Baal from morning until noon. So we've already gone a couple of 3 or 4 hours here. And they're saying, Baal, answer us, oh Baal. Send down fire. And they're calling out, and this is so sad. But there was no sound. No one answered. So that didn't work, and so they started dancing around the altar. They started hopping over that thing, standing on it, jumping up and down, making, maybe we can generate enough heat this thing get going, that's what I'm thinking. And they're hopping around, and they're doing rain dances and fire dances and whatever they can come up with, and nothing's happening. By the time we get to noon, it says in verse 27, Elijah mocked them. Now the guy I was listening to this week, he says, I can see him sitting over there on a rock somewhere with a piece of straw in his mouth, chewing on it, watching them do all this stuff. And it says this is a good place to see where God has a sense of humor. Because he says, Elijah looks at him and says, you're going to have to shout louder. He's a God. He wants to hear big voices. He's a big God you got. You need to shout louder. So maybe he says, maybe he's just thinking about it. He's listening to you. He's heard you, but he's going to think it over a little bit. He says, maybe he's wandered away. Now, this is the CSB version we're reading, but wandered away in another version means maybe he's removed himself from the picture for a minute. This is a nice way of saying maybe he's going to the bathroom. Maybe he's gone, in one translation, to relieve himself. He's playing with them. He knows that their God is just a pagan, fake nothing. And he knows that his God is the real true God, and Elijah is mocking him. He said maybe he's on the road. Maybe he's sleeping. You have to shout louder and he'll wake up. So they shouted louder, it says. Verse 28, they shouted loudly. Then they cut themselves with knives and spears, according to their custom. Boy, isn't he a gracious God, Baal? He waits for them to cut themselves up and blood goes from their body before he'll listen. And so you see what Elijah is doing here. He is showing before all the people who have been silent, maybe afraid of these prophets and Ahab and Jezebel. What are you afraid of? This God they say they have is nothing. He's powerless. All afternoon they kept on raving until the offering of the evening sacrifice. They did this all day long. And you got to think, somewhere in this 6-7 hours, that some of these guys go, this ain't going to happen. They knew. They wouldn't admit it. They sure weren't going to say it. Because Ahab's over here watching, and he's got his guys waiting with swords. Because if they don't make this happen, he may kill them. But again, here at the end of 29, just about the saddest thing you could read. They kept on until the offering of the evening sacrifice, but there was no sound. No one answered. No one even paid attention. If we follow anything except the real God, that's what we're going to get. No answer. And nobody that's going to pay attention and no sound. I thank goodness when I pray to God, he hears me. And he answers me. And he talks to me through the Holy Spirit in my heart and soul. And he pays attention. Because Baal did none of that. Only God did. So here Baal is. He's the God of rain. He's the God of fertility. He's the God of nature, lightning and fire. Look, it's dry. It's dry as a bone. One little spark would have set this thing up, right? I mean, you've burnt leaves before. You don't burn them when they're wet. Yes, you do, so you don't set the world on fire. But if you have dry stuff, it burns fast. That's why people say, well, I'm going to wait for that tree to dry out, that brush to dry out, then I can burn it quickly. There was no reason that Baal would have any problem with this. Everything was dry. He could send down one little spark, poof, this thing's going to burn right up, and they were going to be able to stand back. And that's not what happened, because Baal didn't even listen. That's because Baal is a false god to begin with. So in verse 30, Elijah says to all the people, come near to me. And in my terminology, he's saying, my little layman's term, he says, now, watch this. Because that's what he's fixing to do. He says, y'all get ready. Because you think that was pitiful. I'm fixing to show you something. I've been saving this all day. These boys have been jumping up and down and stuff. This has been silly. You get ready because you're fixing to see something. Y'all get your marshmallows and your chocolate bars. This place is fixing to light up. And so he says, come near to me. He saw all the people that approached him, and then he repaired the Lord's altar that had been torn down. This is key. Remember we talked about the sacrificing a few minutes ago? Why did he not use rain and use fire? Because he was fixing to do two things. He was going to show God's power to all these people and Ahab too, and all these Baal prophets. But he was also going to do something else. He was going to fix to have an offering sacrifice. And so he repaired the altar. He goes in there and picks up those 12 stones. Let's read 31. Elijah took the 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, Israel will be your name. Go way back in history when God told Jacob, your name is changed now to Israel. That's where they got their name of Israel. Jacob was changed to Israel. He had 12 sons. They were the 12 tribes, and that became the Israelite nation. And until they busted it up in the 10 and 2, they were all united. But in their own selfish desires, they split everything up and they ignored God. And here Elijah is reminding them, you used to be 12 united nations, 12 united tribes, making one huge family of God. And these 12 tribes are here. He takes the 12 stones. Don't think they didn't know what this meant, because he was showing them, it used to be 12 of you guys. You're not that way anymore, and you're ununited now. And he says, 32, he says, he built an altar with the stones in the name of the Lord. Then he made a trench around it. So he digs a big trench around the thing, enough to hold some water here, 4 gallons it says. And then next, he arranged the wood, cut up the bull, placed it on the wood, and he didn't do anything else as far as any fire. He told them not to do anything with fire. He wasn't going to do it either. He didn't light anything. It says next, on top of doing all that, it's dry now. What would you not do if you're going to build a fire? Dump water on stuff, right? So instead he says, go get some water, pour it on the offering. So they did it. Then he said, now do it again. And he did that. He said, go get it a 3rd time. He soaked this thing down. The wood, the bull, the sacrifice, the stones, the altar, everything there is a mud pit. It's a mushy, mushy mess. Nothing's going to burn because it's so wet. There's so much water that the water ran around the altar and filled the trench. So you got in your mind, I hope, this bull here is prepared, the wood, the trench around it, and it is just soaked with water. And we go to the beach sometimes, the kids, they'll make a little castle, and then they'll dig a little trench around it, and that thing come fill up with water, and it's just a big mud pile. They definitely don't get fire out of that. He trusted God so much that he made the situation more extreme. Why? I think so he can remove all doubt. This wet wood will not burn, but God was about to show them different. These people had watched all day long what was going on. You know, when they saw him dumping water on this stuff, they was thinking, what is going on here? They couldn't light it up, and it was dry. He just soaked this. There's no way that's going to burn. But Elijah trusted him so much, he knew there was something waiting. And the question in this book says, when we are looking to God for something great, how should we prepare to receive God's answer? And we're so tempted to be like those people and say, I'm sorry, this is just too big. God can't fix all of this. But it took Elijah's trust and faith to know that there was something better coming here in just a few minutes. In verse 36, it says, at the time for offering the evening sacrifice, the prophet Elijah approached the altar and said, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. He says it again to remind them of those 12 tribes. He says, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that at your word I have done all these things. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so that this people will know that you, the Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. So a couple of things that's in these verses here. He mentions the sacrifice, so we talked about that. But Elijah approached the altar and calls out to God. And I couldn't help but think, those guys had screamed for hours and hours. And Elijah prays for less than a minute. They're screaming, hollering, jumping up and down. And he approached the altar and bows down and just quietly asks God to help. Calls out for God to reveal himself. I noticed too, he takes no credit. He says, I am your servant, and that at your word I have done all these things. I didn't do any of this on my own. I don't think Elijah just went up there and says, hey, let's have a contest between God and Baal today. He was told by God to do this. This was all to glorify God and to exalt him as the only God. Elijah was obedient. He just did what God told him to do. He's verse 37. He says, answer me, Lord. Answer me. For one reason, so that this people will know that you are the true God. He doesn't want any pats on the back for this. There was a craving in him to call these people back to God. This had to be something that was not on his credit. And he was willing to hear say, with the people listening, answer me so that these people will know that you are the God, the one and only God. Not Baal, not all these other pagan things that they're worshiping, just you. He was a humble servant. He was willing to just be there and be God's servant, and God did all the rest. 850 to 1. I was reading this week about somewhere in the Civil War, and I can't remember the exact battle, but some of the troops were surrounded on all sides, and one of the little soldiers goes up to his general and says, "We've got them right where we want them. Now we can attack them from every direction." And that's how Elijah was here. He said, "I've got everybody here. I've got the altar. I've got every person. I've got all the prophets in one place. I got Ahab sitting here. Everybody's going to see this all at the same time. This is going to be a once and for all thing." And in verse 38, here's when it happens. Then the Lord's fire fell and consumed the burnt offering. Listen now. The wood, the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. It vaporized everything there. In an instant, God sent fire down and consumed it all. I've never seen a rock burn up, have you? I have not. This says it burned up the offering, the wood, the stones, the dust, and licked up every drop of water that there was. Now, I know what Elijah was thinking. Hot dog. He did exactly what he said. I also know what those people were thinking. Two things popped into mind. I saw a video this week of this cage full of tigers, and they're all about the same size, and they're all fighting and jumping on one another, and some of them are playing, but some of them really are fighting a little bit. And out of nowhere, this guy comes and opens up a cage. Have y'all seen this? This guy opens up a cage, the gate to the cage, and a tiger comes in that is like twice as big as all the rest of them. I mean, he's huge. He's like a Goliath type tiger. He walks, and the minute that tiger walked into the cage and they shut the gate, he goes over to the biggest one, and the biggest one rolled over on his back like wanting to play. And being studying this lesson at the same time, I thought that's probably about how they felt. Even those Baal prophets, that's probably about how they felt. Don't you know, after jumping up and down all day, they see that happen and they go, "Man, we're in trouble." They did. Another thing that came to mind was, you know how when you're a kid, some of you may not have older ones yet, but you will experience this. There's a day when they're going to, or you have seen a teenager do this to a parent somewhere, and they hit that one day where they say, "I'm talking back today. Today's the day. I'm grown." Whatever that age is, 12, 13, is it earlier now? I don't know. But anyway, they hit that age where they say, "Today's the day I'm talking back." And then once mom and dad quickly make known that there's a declaration, "I'm the parent, you're not," and then they back right off. And that's the way I see this going right here, is because the minute all this happened, what's the first thing that people do? They drop face down on their knees and say, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." They had told them before, you're going to have to pick. It's time for you to pick. If you're going to worship God, worship God. If you're going to worship Baal, then worship Baal. But you're going to choose, and you're going to choose today, and I'm going to show you why. This all happens, and they didn't even hesitate. Bam! The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. They call out to Him fast. I'd be thinking that the reason they did it is because they didn't want the next thunderbolt of fire to come down to hit them. And so that's exactly what they do. They quickly recognized who the real God was. And they got firsthand evidence of it all day long. This Baal we've been told to worship can't do anything. He can't bring the rain. We've been out with that for 3.5 years. And he can't bring thunder. And he can't even bring fire, and it's as dry as can be. This was the perfect setup for what God had in mind. And Elijah was the humble person that was willing to carry it out. All he was willing to do was just be obedient. He didn't have to do anything. Is that God said do this, he did this. God said do this, he did this. And we're going to learn more about Elijah next week. After this all happens, there's a few things that happen. I'm going to fill in the blanks right here. Because right after this, Elijah calls to the people and says, well, there's going to have to be some consequences for this. He says, we're going to round up all those pagan prophets over there, and we're taking them down to this called the Wadi River, and we're going to kill them there. And he did. They took them all down, and they all were killed and exterminated. And I read this in background this week. That river was full of blood from where he had killed them. And that river runs straight to a little town called Phoenicia. Guess who's from Phoenicia? Jezebel. So she said, he was in a sense saying, this pagan god that you worship, Baal, that you hold up so high, you brought this stuff here, you can have it back. I'm going to send this blood right back to where you came from. And so after that, Elijah tells Ahab, says, look, you need to go get you something to eat, something to drink real quick, because the rain's fixing to fall. Now, Ahab, in Scripture, it says he goes and eats and drinks. So he believed what Elijah said. I would have too at this point. I would have said, yes, sir. What kind of sandwich can I get for you? I'm going to get me one. And I'd have been obeying him completely. So he did. And right after this, Elijah goes up on this same mountain where he would been all day. And he says, he bows down, says he put his head between his knees. And we're not told what he prays. We're not told what he says. But right after that, he sends a messenger boy to go over to the sea on the other side and look for the clouds in the sky. And the boy came back and said there's nothing there. Sends him back again. He does this 7 times. And on the 7th time, the little boy comes back and says, there's one small cloud. And he says, here it comes. And he tells Ahab, said, you better get in your chariot and fly, because you're fixing to get poured on. And right after that, that's exactly what happens. The clouds darkens, all these, the sky darkens, clouds everywhere. Wind kicks up, just like we saw these storms this last couple of days. And the downpour comes, like I rode through coming out of Goldsboro. And Ahab hops in his chariot, and he's getting it fast as he can to try to find some dry territory. And Elijah, we're told, is given supernatural power by God here, and he runs like a speed demon and passes the chariot and beats Ahab back to town, to Jezreel. And that's where we're going to stop, because that's where chapter 15 ends. And next week we'll get in a little farther, because there's somebody who wasn't there that day, present to watch all this. Her name was Jezebel. And she is boiling mad at what happens. And next week we're going to get into some of that. All right, anybody got questions or comments? Okay, let's close with a prayer. Ed, would you pray for us?